Chapter 46. You know Colin is a smooth talker and a people-pleaser, the shadow declaimed while they all pushed their will against the force of its words. Now, I know we're none of us on intimate terms, but I'm willing to bet that some of you can't help reacting with contempt to that, even as others have quickly learned to appreciate it. But you know what I think? I think the impression Colin has made here has not prepared y'all to understand just what a badass you're dealing with. I don't need you to talk me up, Colin grated. It was a struggle to get words out, to do anything at all, and not the kind of struggle against which he could test his muscles or magic, but an internal one. Like attempting to push on through fatigue. At a glance, he could tell the other dragons, for all their phenomenal power, were fighting the same battle. Imahalafin's warning had definitely been on point. The three elder dragons at least were probably more powerful beings than the entity, but that didn't matter when contending with gods. No amount of power would help you against a creature which got to decide what the rules of reality were. Buddy, you've had ample chances to take the reins yourself, the shadow retorted, its tone subtly condescending yet not unkind. Now this is my show. Don't worry, I won't make you look bad. I came here resolved to tell the truth, an imperfect person though you may be, the truth reflects well on you, Colin. Its wavering form, already barely visible in the darkened chamber, suddenly collapsed. Shadows swarmed across the huge walls, strategically obscuring the glowing glass panels to cast crazy patterns across the flat surfaces, abstract and seemingly random at first, but when the entity's voice echoed again out of nothing, beginning to form shapes. I have followed this man, who had been a humble scribe and will be a god, as he achieved feats which would cement the reputation of any adventurer. I was by his side as he stepped across the boundary line of the plains themselves, crossing from the haunted ruins of ancient Nervath into the unearthly home of those tormented shades, the Moonless Tower. Through its darkened gates, through its black halls echoing with the lamentations of the damned, down into its very vaults, and then back out, to the freedom of the mortal plane. Unscathed, unimpeded, and victorious. The shadows across the walls formed an eerie puppet theater while the entity spoke. Separated by the vertical columns of the room in sections where the time stone was open to reveal ancient machinery ticking and whirring away, across every segment of blank wall, scenes came to life. Silhouettes of a man, of Colin, navigating the uncanny geometry of the Moonless Tower, its traps and the hostile undead thronging those corridors. It gave him a deeply uneasy feeling to recognize every one of those scenes. Even viewed from outside himself as mere shadow puppets. He could match each one to a memory. Every ghost appeased or avoided, every broken stretch of corridor successfully traversed, each trap disarmed or evaded. The entity wasn't lying. Colin knew very well that the best deceivers lied as little as possible. You did that, Colin? Vadarl, she asked. No nickname, no mockery. She just sounded plainly impressed. And that was before we journeyed to Kval Ravine. The entity crowed. Wait, that's full of trolls, Fenorexa protested. Trolls. Agreed the shadow in a booming voice, as all around the walls the images shifted, silhouettes now showing Colin navigating the treacherous bridges and creeping stealthily past enormous shapes which, vague though they were when depicted only in shadow, bristled with distinctive spiky hair, dangled protruding limbs from their nests, swelling and contracting ominously with heavy sleeping breath. If I were embellishing this story, this is a great place to throw in something about troll slaying, but I think by this point you all know our boy better than that. It's plenty impressive enough by my way of thinking that he got past them, deep into their nest down in the old ruins at the ravine's base, and emerged with treasure in hand. What was so important that you'd risk that? Venomox demanded. Mere trinkets, replied the entity as the shadow play around the walls altered again. Oh, treasures to be sure, wealth beyond reckoning to anyone except dragons, not that Colin is one to be motivated by such pedestrian concerns. No, all of this was in pursuit of mere bargaining chips. Tokens, to be exchanged for the real target, in a feat which played more to his own strengths. The shadows all but roiled, reminding Colin of the sinuous yet abrupt movement of the lesser devils he had encountered on the way to that one. There it was. As the dragons craned their necks to watch, the shadows seemed to converge upon one panel of blank time stone, showing a horned figure quite unlike their own smaller forms, brandishing a heavy scepter, then shifting and resolving into that figure sitting across from the smaller shape of a man, heads leaning together deep in conversation. From no less than the devils of the ravening host did we need the penultimate piece of this puzzle, and with no less than an archfiend did Arkansas Colin barter his hard-won treasures for it. Bartered, secured a favorable bargain, and departed in peace. None of that was anything like you make it sound, Colin protested, finding it easier to speak. Was the entity relaxing its grip, or had he only now gathered enough will to push through? I don't know why you want to promote me like this, any more than I understand why you've done any of it. But in all those adventures, I did nothing but follow meticulous instructions. Step by step, it was you who led me through it. I was just your puppet. You see what I'm working with? The entity complained. I have tried and tried to build him up a bit, but to this day all I hear is this. Ladies, help me out here. Loath as I am to validate this thing, said Tiavathyres, it is correct, husband. These are incredible feats for any mortal, and all the more so for a scribe with no combat training to speak of. It seems very strange indeed, to me, that you would devalue your accomplishment simply because you had help. And help only in the form of direction? Isairo shook her head. Regardless of that, the courage that must have taken. I appreciate modesty in a man, Imaralafin at it, but yours is very nearly pathological, husband. Also, not for nothing, the ability to correctly follow precise instructions is not so insignificant. No, I am not simply being glib. To remember and execute a complex plan while under the kinds of stress described reveals great strength of mind, and of will. Traits which mark the greatest of mages. Or kings, or warriors, for that matter. I have heard of one individual who stood before a devil of the ravening host and walked away without having to strike it down, Tiavathyres said gravely. 5 minutes ago, that number was 0. Okay, I agree. Our boy's serious business, said Vedaralshi, but maybe we should be a bit more careful about going along with the spooky shadow revenge god? Stubbornly refusing to do anything it seems to want is the same kind of trap, Phenorexa said quietly, and one a god of manipulation would know very well. We're already good and committed to supporting Colin, after all. There's no harm in saying so. So the question is, why? The entity exclaimed. Colin found himself grudgingly in awe of its sheer stage presence. He had never seen it play to an audience before. The creature delivered lines like some combination of bard and priest, effortlessly commanding the attention of the room, dragons, ghosts and all. By this point, you all know Colin well enough to find it surprising, not that he could achieve such things, but that he would be interested. I'm sure it has begun to tickle at the back of your minds. This is the man who slew Atraximos the Dread. Sure, anyone who seized on the secret of apotheosis right under the old monster's nose could have done the same, but why would this guy even want to? He is so nice, humble, and funny, down to earth, caring, a real people person, an inveterate supporter. Someone whose first instinct when surrounded by awesomely powerful and incredibly beautiful women under his nominal control was to start figuring out how to make you all as happy as he was able. What drives the nicest dude on the block to brave these terrors, to accomplish these feats? There is an old Nurut proverb, Phenorexa said unexpectedly. Repay not kindness with betrayal, for 'tis when the gentlest soul is pushed too far that the very devils quail. Everyone turned to stare at her, including the vague shape of the entity. She shrugged. Just because we can't get rid of this thing doesn't mean we need accommodate it. I am stealing its dramatic timing. No matter how hard or long I work at it, Vedaralshi said mournfully, I just cannot compete with your sheer pettiness, Phenorexa. The blue dragon sneered, and for once Colin found himself hoping they were going to properly start in on each other again. but this time it seemed the entity's hold over them remained. Phenorexa had exhausted her store of rebellion, and the dark god continued uncontested. I see you've read a book or two in your time. You have it exactly. Which brings us to what I know you've all been really waiting for, just what made the gentlest soul you know snap. Darkness rushed across the walls, the silhouettes resolving into the phantom skyline of Revkabad, viewed from multiple angles. They tilted and shifted as if the viewers were rushing toward each at high speed, a disorienting spectacle seen from so many directions at once, but resolved into an interior space Kaln knew all too well, even when seen only as a flat shadow, the great entry hall of the Royal Archives. Insight burst upon him, and now that it was too late, he understood the trap. It was the dread that cued him in. Kaln knew what the entity was about to begin narrating, and in that last anticipatory moment he found that what he feared wasn't his new family learning these things, but having to sit through a recitation of it again. Having all that pain dragged up and himself dragged through it, after all he'd been through to distance himself from it. With that, like a row of falling dominoes, the pieces began to tumble into place. Godlings were beings of transition, and per Ma'alafin's teachings, it was Kaln's experiences which would shape the divine being he was slowly becoming. Particularly intensely emotional experiences, such as he was about to be subjected to. In the presence of his dragon family, bound to him not only by his innate divine power over dragons, but the actual, personal bonds he had begun to develop with them. They would see and share Kaln's pain, the betrayal and grief, the rage and drive for vengeance. It would resonate further with him, attuned to dragons as he was. From his established aspect of dragon power, shaped through his remembered anguish and their vindictive natures, linked together by that power, a feedback loop focusing him on the revenge he had once so craved. He'd been blind to it, or rather, deftly misdirected by a master manipulator. The entity didn't care about Hactria or the Lord Scribe or any of Kaln's troubles in Revkabad. In fact, it was probably afraid to venture there and antagonize the Nine. For the entity's purposes it wouldn't matter if the dragons never turned their attention to Revkabad to enact Kaln's revenge. Indeed, there had never been any chance of it. That was Izyro's territory, and if even Atraximos hadn't dared trespass there, the rest of them wouldn't. She would never lash out in anger, no matter how provoked, but would act meticulously within the law to excise the corruption growing in her court. No, none of that mattered. It was all about Kaln, about divinity. About bathing him in remembered pain and fury, shaping his godhead toward what the entity wanted. A match, apparently, for its own. A new god of vengeance. This is where a bardic god would spin you some piffle about destiny, the entity proclaimed, about our hero's secret heritage or some such. I am pleased to tell you there will be no such nonsense today. Arkansas Kaln was an orphan, left behind by perfectly common parents of no particular peculiarity save the relative youth in which their tragic and premature demise occurred. He was lucky enough to have been orphaned in Rivak, rather than the many places where that was a sentence of desperate poverty and an early grave. But in Golden Revkabad, the state likes to give orphans a solid upbringing, a thorough education, and a swift route into civil service. By all the gods, was it going to start that far back? Of course it was, Kaln realized. It was making a presentation, not just relaying facts. Its whole plan was to deliver maximum emotional impact, and he didn't doubt it had as much storytelling mastery as any bard. What could he do? The weight of the entity's will hung heavy upon him again. He could not speak, couldn't leave, could not do anything to interrupt this disaster. Couldn't even struggle against the hand holding him in place, because it didn't weigh on him like an outside force, but simply the rules of the world. An invisible, intangible principle of this little patch of reality, the law that Kaln was not to interrupt the shadowy god, any more than he could flap his arms and take off. It left himself. It was a thin chance and a desperate gambit, but it being the only one before him, Kaln seized upon it, doubling down immediately when he realized the entity's will did not block him from focusing within. Kaln closed his eyes and concentrated. tuning out the creature reciting his most painful experiences, complete with visual aids in the form of silhouette plays spread across the walls around them, took a supreme effort of his own will. Fortunately, Colin could tune out distractions and focus. He was proud of that skill, as it did not come naturally but had been laboriously acquired and extensively practiced. None other than the Lord Scribe had begun to drill him in his early teens, having noticed Colin's tendency to lose track of what he was doing and chit-chat with anyone who spoke in his vicinity, or wandered across his field of view. He drew upon all of those teachings now, blotting out the entity, the dragons, the ghosts, the story, all of it, turning his attention fully within himself. Upon the divine glow always waiting there. Now, with the entity's own power laying heavy over them all, Colin could appreciate it better. It was a candle against the sun, the nascent power of a fresh godling compared against that of a full-grown deity. Though the comparison didn't favor him, he could see the similarities. Different colors of ink, but nonetheless similar substances. Flexing his divine strength against the entities would be hopeless. He could see that at the merest glance. Fine. Contests of brute force weren't his strong suit, anyway. He studied the power of divinity flowing around them. Focusing thus, he found he could sense the way the entity exerted its will, contrasted with magic. Magic, which he knew from his affinity with the dragons regardless of his inability to use it himself, was a kind of energy, an animating force that crackled with potential, a glow illuminating all those aspects of creation which it touched. Divinity was something else. Studying the way reality and magic seemed to curve and flow around the entity's power, he felt a stir of recognition. Something in his memory was gravity. Colin was no scholar, but like most scribes was an avid reader of any eclectic material which happened to catch his interest, and unlike many scribes was a people person who loved to entice his acquaintances to gush about their own passions, and listen intently to them. He had stumbled across the theory in some scroll, asked a couple of scholars about it over drinks, and spent the rest of that evening listening with amusement and fascination as these increasingly tipsy natural philosophers ranted about the fundamental mysteries of reality. Most of it had gone over his head, but he distinctly recalled their insistence that gravity was not a force, but an effect. That mass, all mass, created a kind of indentation in the fabric of reality, which caused other mass to flow toward anything larger. Divinity was like that, not exerting power, but reshaping existence itself, causing power to flow through the channels it prescribed. He was a tiny moon orbiting the entity's much greater existence, which itself was held in a course of balance dictated by other, larger divinities. The 4, the 9, even maybe Tiamat in her nearby territory. Colin couldn't sense any of them directly right now, but as he tightened his concentration he found he could perceive the impact they made simply by existing. Wow, Imalafine was once again right, the entity was nothing compared to these ancient gods. Just as he was nothing compared to it. Oh, that bitch. Vadaril, she exclaimed in outrage, rocking his concentration. Against his will, Colin found himself rising up out of his deep well of focus, mentally rehashing everything that had happened while he'd been in that near meditative state. Right. The entity had explained Bactria to them, from his very first encounter with her to the end, when her father had learned of their affair and taken exception, and she had cast him off like a broken plaything without hesitation. He knew what was next. Bactria's father, unsatisfied with the end of their relationship, determined to remove Colin and all the potential scandals he might cause as a factor. With a powerful man leveraging assets against him, he had turned to the Lord Scribe for help. And found he had been very much mistaken about his mentor's priorities. Colin struggled to recenter himself. He didn't know whether he could truly achieve anything by examining his and the entity's divine essence. Maybe there was something there he could exploit, but even if not, he had to shut himself off from this recitation. The only victory he could attain here was by refusing to let it affect him emotionally. It was hard this time. Before he dreaded having to listen to this story. Now, he'd heard the greater half of it already, and though he had succeeded in denying the entity his full attention, the words had still reached his ears. They were now worming into him, threatening his fragile concentration. The memories they brought up. The agony. The betrayal. The rage. Calm clung to serenity, to focus. Shut out disturbances, ignore voices, do the work. Just as the Lord Scribe had taught him. The same Lord Scribe who had been. A new distraction intervened. Even with his eyes closed, Colin could feel Imar-Alafine's focus center upon him as if it were his own. He sensed her look at and through him, with her eyes and with more senses than he could imagine existed, through the lens of her countless years of mastery. He felt her take in his entire being, recognize in an instant what he was trying to do. And then she offered it to him. In silence, in fact, he could also perceive the intricate layer of magic and concentration and borrowed divinity of her own, leveraged from the countless gods whose power she had learned to use, shielding what she was doing from the entity's own perception. It swirled around him, open and willing. Colin seized it as easily as he had the wards in Atraximos's chamber. More so, this time, as he was not passively taking power from a dragon, but entering active and willful cooperation. Imar-Alafine's presence within his mind was cooling, calming, both a foundation upon which he could stand and a bastion protecting him from outer interference. Her arts of the mind flowed through him, and suddenly he was concentrating not with the skill of an out-of-practice young scribe, but the mastery of a sorceress older than modern civilization. Suddenly, he was analyzing divinity and magic through the perspective of the ultimate master of this craft. Colin relaxed into her, allowed her to lead. She nudged his consciousness, guiding him in swift detail along the intricacies of the power surrounding them. The shapes the entity was carving in reality. At first Colin tried to concentrate upon the effects holding them all still and silent in its narrative grasp, but Imar-Alafine pushed against his mind, guiding his concentration away from that. Instead, she directed him to the fissures and indentations in reality connecting him to the entity. She led his attention meticulous across subtleties of form that he hadn't even been able to perceive unassisted. Though she did not project words into his mind, Colin could sense just from the magic she was using that actual telepathy would risk the concealment she had laid and give away what they were doing to the entity. She skillfully guided his attention into minute details, making sure he absorbed the purpose of each before moving on. Around them, the entity declaimed in pantomime, dragging the surrounding dragons through the emotional ordeal it desired to inflict upon Colin. Silently guided by his consort's skill, he let it wash over his consciousness, impervious. He could see it, now, the shape of what the entity was doing. Not what it was doing in this moment, but overall, the strings it was trying to tie to Colin. Or rather, the lack of them. It was not control the god desired, but only influence. From such simple hints he could still not intuit why it was doing all this. Everything Imar-Alafine had said about gods indicated that creating more gods was out of character for them. He could sense her curiosity and confusion at this, too. But together, they mapped the flows of the entity's agenda, at least with regard to Colin, and found very little. It wanted him to become a creature like itself, a divine force of vengeance. And then, seemingly, it only wished to unleash him upon the world. Not to control him. Why? Well, that was a question for another time. What mattered here and now was that he would not be shaped by this creature. He would be the master of his own destiny. Colin opened his eyes, and looked right past the shadow of the god before him, meeting Imar-Alafine's blue eyes. A smug smile curled across her muzzle, and she nodded to him once. Within himself, he felt a gentle push from her. It did not have words, but the meaning was so focused he could not help forming them himself. Go forth, husband, and conquer. And there he sat, the entity said sonorously. All around them, the shadows on the walls showed darkness, each panel centered upon a huddled figure as the surrounding gloom closed in upon him, descending until there was only blackness. Alone and bereft of all aid, in that cell in the deepest of Ravkabit's prisons, a hole reserved for its most dangerous criminals, not for some harmless scribe who had done no wrong. Worse than the imprisonment itself was the nature of it. Outside the law, obscured from all record, the documents doctored and wardens lied to. He was only to be there just long enough for the very few who knew of his presence to lose interest. And then, it would be a quiet knife in the back, not any lawful punishment of the state. Cullen's enemies did not even want revenge, only silence. Vengeance is the province of those who have been wronged. Slowly, the darkness receded, first revealing the pale coppery color of time stone, then illumination as the unnatural shadows relinquished their hold on the Temeglass panels. "We know," the entity proclaimed in a thunderously ringing tone, "who has been wronged here." Cullen could feel it in them all, exactly what the entity had tried to create in him. The emotions roiled in all the dragons save Amir Alafin, who had shared her focus with him upon their work. Each of them felt different shades of it, but there were universals. Outrage, revulsion, grief born of their bonds with him. Even Vanamax, to his surprise, was incensed at the tale of Cullen's suffering. Iziro's anger had layers and depths he could scarcely begin to fathom. But he had escaped it. Cullen stood calm and unaffected. This had not been a trauma to shape his being and resonate through his connection with the dragons. He had won. The entity loomed over them all as a pillar of shadow, confident in its victory. Cullen shrugged, smiled, and spoke. Chapter 47. I'm sorry I kept this from you, Iziroa. Cullen had rarely put so much effort into his delivery, but the stakes here were far more than just maintaining his relationship with her. He made his voice a performance, but a subdued one, sincere, warm, and above all, calm. That was the crucial thing. The entity wanted rage, pain, grief, and the dragons chomping at the bit to avenge all that Cullen had suffered, and it had worked skillfully toward that goal. Cullen could feel it churning in them, see it in their aggressive postures. Thanks to Amir Alafin, he had thwarted the core of the entity's gambit by keeping himself serene, denying it the resonance of his own pain to feed the dragons, but this struggle was ongoing. And speaking of Amir Alafin, it was not Iziroa who answered him. What, you're only sorry to her? The white dragon snorted. He could feel her as keenly as he did himself. She was the calmest of the six. She'd been concentrating along with Cullen during the entity's grand production, and so not only understood more of what was going on here, but hadn't had her full attention to give to its ploy. Performance, then. Cullen kept it up, turning back to her and answering with meticulously sculpted delivery. Wryly amused, affectionate, above all countering the furious emotion crackling in the air with his own projected calm. Political corruption in the courts of Rivkablet is her business, you know. And specifically, none of yours. HMPH. She stuck her nose in the air, but did so while smiling. Yes, fine, I am certainly not about to trespass upon Iziro's domain. It's not as if I have any inclination toward mortal politics, anyway. Bless her. Between them, they were already beginning to cool the mood. Iziro stepped forward, lowering her head nearly to the floor, and extending her neck toward Cullen until she ever so gently pressed her nose against him. The merest flex of her muscles could have flung him across the vault, were he not an impervious godling, of course, but the touch was tender enough not to even push him over. You and I both, and others here besides, have recent cause to refrain from criticizing anyone else's judgment, husband. Having heard all that, I can understand why you wish to put it behind you. Thank you, love, Cullen said softly, reaching up to stroke her scales. He could feel her anger, too, keenly enough to discern its multiple flavors. Her deep, personal offense to learn of such skullduggery in the empire she had so laboriously built to honor the spirit of law and justice. But also, empathetic pain at what Cullen had suffered, and fury at those responsible. Iziroa, however, was control personified. Her rage was banked, stored away to be used later. In that moment, he was more grateful even than usual for her composure. She was another moderating force exactly when he needed one most. So, Vadaril, she interjected loudly, scraping her claws against the floor and lashing her tail, what are we gonna do about these assholes? Naturally, it would be her. Also, now that Colin focused on them, her siblings were equally quivering with the desire to lash out, which in both cases surprised him. Of course, having been raised on Iziro's lectures, Venomax might just be offended by lawless abuse of power in the Imperial Court, and, well, apparently he'd made more progress in befriending Fenurixa than he'd realized. Now, both of them were physically on point, as if eager to charge at someone. Tiavathyris, Colin said aloud, turning to his third wife with a deliberately, carefully gentle smile. The assholes in question are, as was just pointed out, within Iziro's domain, she said, turning a reproving stare upon Vedaralshi. We will do nothing in Revkabit or to any citizen thereof without her blessing, which I do not expect will be forthcoming. But Vedaralshi looked aghast, and if anything, even more angry. But you heard what? Daughter. Tiavathyris stepped closer to her, and the younger dragon warily leaned away, but her mother only reached out with her neck to gently bump her forehead against Vedaralshi's. I know that you like first-hand experience, but we have spoken on this. Anger makes a fine fuel, but a poor decision-maker. Control it, for if it controls you, it will lead you consistently into disaster. Wiser words were never spoken, the entity agreed magnanimously. Vengeance is, as they say, a dish best served cold. I am, of course, speaking as an expert, with full respect for a fellow specialist. Naturally. It had been too much to hope Colin would be able to calm this down without active resistance from the vengeful god trying to rile it up. If anything, he was lucky to have gone that many seconds before it intervened. He focused his attention now upon Tiavathyris, taking in the expression she turned upon the floating shadow in their midst, and also the complex layers of emotion he could sense resonating in her. Colin was less certain about this than with regard to the other two. However, this was about more than the vibe in the room. There were deeper forces at work, and it was at those the entity had aimed its gambit. Rather than letting it abuse his bond with the dragons to goad them, he now chose to affirm that bond through a gentler measure, trust. That is true, my lady wife. There are none here and few anywhere who can speak with your expertise in the arts of war. What can you tell us about vengeance? For a split second the wavering form of the entity went as still as ice, and Colin knew he had not only scored another hit, but that it was now aware it was losing ground here. Tiavathyris's deep current of feeling, as usual, was too complex and nuanced for him to analyze in any great detail, but from her face alone he could see she understood more than the surface of what was happening here, and what he needed from her. I have little but contempt for it, the legendary warrior dragon stated. Iziro could far better explain the spirit of justice to us, so I will refrain, and I would advise any here to attend her on that subject should she deign to share her wisdom. But of revenge, I will say only that it is at best wasted effort, and far too seldom is its outcome even at paltry best. It is an endless cycle of escalation and ruin. And even were all its destruction not enough, in the end, it does not even satisfy. I have seen many a warrior standing in the ashes of their well-earned retribution, seeing nothing but the further retaliation coming back upon them in the future, and feeling only hollow. I am grateful for this perspective, Colin murmured. I wasn't facing any of this before. Standing here, now, with it all out in the open, I finally realized the fault was mine. Are you serious? The entity exclaimed. Colin. Buddy. Look, I know you like your self-deprecation, but come on, man. Nobody deserves what happened to you. Even if you were actually some kind of asshole cruising for a comeuppance, the people who harmed you were specifically unjustified. They had power over you, and used it, for personal gain at best, and honestly, in at least one case nothing but petty amusement. Colin, you did nothing wrong. Not to them, Colin agreed with a smile. No, you're right, I would never argue that point. But what I should have done at the first opportunity after I came here was to tell Iziro the entire story, and let her handle it. Revkabit has laws, and a nearly omnipotent empress capable of enforcing them when other mechanisms fail. put my own feelings above the needs of justice. How can you stand it? The entity burst out, all its normal insouciance and jocularity gone. Its shadowy form was roiling so hard it practically shimmered in the glow of the Tameglass. Colin was struck by the thought that, inveterate deceiver though it was, he was finally seeing the god's real feelings. There was no malice in its words, but its voice trembled with exactly what it had been trying to stir in all of them: anger, pain, and grief. They're out there, walking around, free as birds and happy as clams. It's not even that they paid no price for mistreating you, no, they get to reap the rewards of power and position as the upper caste of one of the world's richest empires. Your Lord Scribe, that vile cretin Hactria, they are laughing about what they did and how easy it was. How is it not eating you alive? Because. Colin slowed, stopped, then smiled as the realization hit him. Because I've moved on. Well, bully for you, the entity spat. I'm sure that'll be a great comfort to the next poor bastard to get trampled onto their fancy boots. This is exactly what I meant. There is recourse for exactly this kind of thing in any just society. I am at fault for not leveraging that at the very first opportunity. I was just too in my own head, too concerned with myself. First with my schemes for revenge, and then with what I could do to help my family. He turned back to Iziroa, who nodded and answered. Being a selfish and callous lover is not and cannot be against the law in any reasonable society. As your wife I despise that woman with every fiber of my being, but as Empress I cannot set the precedent of inflicting punishment out of personal dislike. That would be as grave a betrayal of the public's trust as that which my Lord Scribe committed. You may be assured, however, I will deal with him. Well, there's that much, at least, the entity said bitterly. Carefully, and thoughtfully, Iziroa continued, with an eye to the larger picture. Corruption is never the result of one person's actions, and rarely of just the two involved in a particular illicit deal. Its roots spread like the cuds of vines, too numerous and deep to be pulled up. The only solution is to render the soil itself inhospitable to it. I have a great deal of work to do, it seems, to diagnose the sickness in my empire. There must be investigation before there is punishment. And you really plan to just ignore Hactria? The entity demanded. You wouldn't even have to break any of your laws to teach her the weight of her actions, you know. All it would take would be to let her know that you know, and that Colin is important to you. Let her live out her days in the terror of knowing her Empress might, at any moment, change her mind. What could be more fitting than that? Iziroa, like any politician, had an excellent poker face, but Colin could clearly feel that idea resonated with her. In fact, studying her emotional state, he suddenly suspected she'd already thought of that before the entity had spoken. Naturally, it was a perfect revenge, one which didn't even violate her principles. In fact, he rather liked the idea himself, but right now that could not be the priority. If he was to uproot the entity's grip on his life and that of his family, revenge as a concept must be repudiated here. All her life means. Well, not all of mine, anymore, but that's still way too many years to waste on the likes of Hactria, he said, making his calm voice a deliberate counterpoint to the entity's agitation. How long should I have to dwell on the worst moments of my own life? She is beneath me. I have better things to do. There's no possible satisfaction I could hope for from retaliating against my enemies that's half as good as the simple happiness I've found here in just a few days. I have people to care for, relationships to build and nurture. A home, a place I belong. Work to do, and a bright future to work toward. And it's so much better I hardly know how to articulate it. Dwelling on revenge is just so miserable. That might have been enough when I had nothing else in the world, but I do, now. I'm over it. Colin felt Emeralafine very gently brush his mind with tendrils of her magic, subtle beneath that carefully woven shield protecting her from the entity's notice. She nudged his attention, granting him another boost to concentration from her own power. Following her direction, Colin recognized a change in the shape of divinity that had developed around them while they'd been talking. The weight, the indentation it made in reality, was lessened. It was weakening, or, rather than the entity itself, the amount of sway it held here. At Imar Alafin's mental nudge, he focused on They weren't connections, exactly, but Colin found he could conceptualize them as grooves between himself and the entity. Not chains of magic binding them together, but a shape it had carved in the universe, inclining magic and will to flow along those channels. Encouraged Colin's own nascent divinity to shape itself in line with the shadows. As Colin had worked to impose calm, had rejected the entities' entreaties for vengeance, they had grown thinner and shallower. He could see, now, just how malleable existence was to the influence of a god. Or even a godling, who knew what he was doing and had Imar Alafin the White Wind to guide his hand. Do you know what happens to a world where everyone gets over it? The entity's voice was all but openly pleading now. Do you know what unfolds when power has no checks and no consequences? It's worse than misery, it's misery driven by malice. In a world that already has earthquakes and hurricanes and plagues, there are more than enough reasons for people to suffer, reasons no one can do anything about. But on top of that, people suffer by their thousands because other people who have power, decide that for whatever reason they want to see it. That is what the world becomes, if those who sit upon their thrones are not taught there is a price. That is the role of law, said Isaiah. What you suggest is only a different flavor of carnage. Law upholding justice is a beautiful fantasy, the entity retorted. Down here in the real world, the law is just another mechanism people use to abuse and exploit whoever they can. If the mistreated don't retaliate, corruption is as inevitable as arithmetic. You've helped me so much, Colin said quietly. All of this, everything I've gained here, is thanks to you, and what you did for me. I wish I could offer you anything in return. But it seems all you want is to make everything worse. I won't throw myself back into the cycle of misery. The entity's vague shape swirled, losing its last vestiges of definition. It was no longer a man-shaped shadow, but a dark blur quivering in the air before them. Don't do this, Colin. You can still make everything right. You can make them pay. I don't care if they pay, I care about what I've already paid. I have my life to live. Those grooves in creation were thinning to almost nothing. The entity's will pressed against the world, trying to carve out those channels, but it was too late. Colin was slipping from its grasp. He could feel it even without Imar Alafin's help, now. The luminosity within him, the rising pressure of his nascent godhead, it was like when he'd sparred with Venomax, like when he had first turned its full force upon the Traxamos. This was a pivotal moment, a point when he formed into who and what he would become. And he would be a creature of his own creation, not the entity's. And there is that old proverb about living. Downed. The entity's voice cracked like a thunderbolt, and darkness roiled throughout the room. The drakes flared their wings and bared teeth, but their elders stood in silence, experienced enough to recognize the final flailing of the defeated. Do not say it. The pressure rose in him, and Colin committed to his choice, his path, his identity and future. He took one step forward, toward the shadow, and spoke his own truth. Living well is the best revenge. The last vestiges of the entity's weight upon reality thinned to nothing. Colin's power roared, rising in him as it leaped forward in strength, taking one great step toward its final shape. Free of the shadow's influence. Colin's shadow snapped free and pooled around his feet where it belonged, severed from the darkness hovering in the air in their midst. And the darkness faded. After its final roar of warning, Colin had expected it to lash out in fury at his defiance, but the thing diminished until it was a barely perceptible dark blur in the air. Why do they always get cold feet? Its voice was totally unlike its usual upbeat cheer, or its more recent anger. It just sounded tired, and sad. Every time, it comes to the end and goes wrong. I'm right, you know, and you have more cause to know it than most. But one little taste of something sweet, and they lose all will to fight. Always. Imar Alafin asked sharply. How many times have you done this? Hell's uncounted, you absurd creature. Have you just been running around the world empowering godlings and then losing control of them? Well, Mr. Family Man, I'll let you off with a warning, said the entity, its voice regaining at least a hint of its usual amusement. Family aren't the people you choose. Family are the people who happen to you, who it's not so easy to get rid of. No matter how they may disappoint you. Live your life, Arkansas Colin. Live well, and don't let anybody push you down again. I'll be seeing you soon. The shadows snapped together, into a single point in the air, then disappeared from their reality with a force that caused the world itself to buckle. Space distorted briefly as if viewed through a curved lens, then quickly recovered its normal shape. With that, it was gone. Just so we're all in agreement, said Phanorexa, that last part was definitely a threat, right? You handled it extremely well, husband, said Imaralafine. Thanks to you. Colin turned to her and bowed, giving her a flirtatious smile up through his lashes in the process. Thank you, Imaralafine. I could never have handled that without your help. What? When? Venomix demanded. She didn't do anything. Imaralafine is, if not the greatest mage alive, a strong contender for the position, my son, Izaroa said with some asperity. That you didn't see her do anything means little. I am pleased to assist you, husband, the White Dragon said primly. Rarely do I deign to guide the uninitiated, but you are gratifyingly clever and quick to learn. Thanks to you I find myself beginning to recall what a pleasure it can be, to work with those of lesser expertise but agile minds. Now then. Of more immediate concern, in light of that silly thing's parting shot, I wish to warn you an important detail about the nature of gods. I'm all ears, he promised. Nature appears to abhor an absolute. When it comes to gods, beings whose essential nature is to reshape reality, this manifests in certain natural principles imposing balance upon them. In the case of a particularly weak god such as that one, this balance takes the form of, in a word, invulnerability. That is true, I have observed it myself, Tevatharis agreed. To be clear, no deity is a simple thing to challenge, but it is counterintuitively true that the greater gods with their legions of followers are often more vulnerable to direct opposition. With the small, singular ones, bound to nothing, floating around the world at liberty. Well, they are somewhat easier to keep out than their more powerful counterparts, but there is often nothing that can be done to meaningfully harm them. I see, Colin murmured, frowning. Well, not that I particularly want to harm it, anyway, but that is still valuable to know. I'm afraid I haven't gotten to the relevant part, husband, said Imaralafine, arching her neck. Remember, balance. Invincibility is one of those absolutes I just told you nature abhors, and so it, too, has a counter. Gods such as Tevatharis describes, which I believe includes our new friend, there, are often more constrained by their divine aspects, whereas the greater gods may have more agency and freedom to act. Ah, said Phanorexa. So Colin's well-meaning attempts to persuade it were probably wasted breath, then. The tiny vengeance god can't stop being vengeful. Which is precisely my concern, Imaralafine continued. That thing is more locked to patterns than most similar beings, and its pattern is based at least in part around revenge. You just repaid its help by repudiating its core value, husband. In light of its final words, I suspect we are now dealing with a true vendetta, a grudge that entity is simply not capable of laying down, even if it might wish to. It has to retaliate, just as you have to breathe. Oh, Vadaryl, she said slowly. So you went and scored us a nemesis. Good job, Pants. Cease your pointless and wise-making, brat, Imaralafine said irritably, thumping her tail against the floor for emphasis. This, assuming my hypothesis is correct, is simply that God's nature, and not Colin's fault. On the contrary, his handling of it has probably spared us an even worse fate than having to fight it in the future. Remember, the core of its plan was to raise Colin up as a dependent, subordinate god, one whose aspect includes control of dragons. The damned thing just tried to enslave all of dragonkind, beginning with us. Hey, that's right. Vaderil, she said, putting on an outraged expression. It can't do that. That's only okay when we do it. Tiavatharis turned a baleful look on her. Fenorexa hid her grin under a wing, but Venomox snorted aloud in amusement, earning a similarly grim stare from his own mother. She is right, though, Izyroa said. For such an affront I would feel the need to retaliate, even if the shadow did not do so first. We should be mindful of Tiavatharis's warning. The creature appears to operate through manipulation and the use of cat's paws. If it attacks us, it will not be directly. I am reasonably confident in our ability to contend with mortal and immortal puns, Tiavatharis agreed. We must not become complacent, but considering who we are, vigilance in our own skills will fare well against any foes. With regard to the god itself, we shall have to rely upon Imar Alafin's expertise. You may rest assured I will devote myself to working out a way to deal with it, Imar Alafin promised, stepping forward into the central space. That will be my very next priority. In the immediate term. She lowered her head, pushing it forward, and gently nuzzled at Kaln, as Izyroa had. Well, sort of. Imar Alafin was less gentle, to the point she would definitely have knocked him off his feet had his imperviousness to dragon attack not kept him upright and immobile. I'm proud of you, husband, she praised. And, with every hour I get to know you better, increasingly eager to watch you become everything you have the potential to be. Kaln leaned forward, spreading his arms to embrace her nose. I'd have been lost without you, Imar Alafin. For that and many other reasons, I hope I never have to be without you again. He felt them approach with his mind, before he felt them pushing on him. Izyroa and Tiavatharis both mimicked the gesture, leaning down to gently nuzzle him. Thus he found himself pleasantly squished between three enormous snouts covered in smooth, iron-hard scales. And also inundated with hot breath that smelled strikingly of molten copper. Oh, get her 'em, you four, Vaderil, she groaned. They have her 'em, Fenorexa said wryly. This one. I think I, for one, will take myself elsewhere. I should check on my princess, anyway. Your princess, Venomox growled. She is now, Fenorexa said sweetly. There ensued multiple aggressive hisses, someone's claws scraping the floor, and heavy footfalls as one of them charged the other. All three of Kaln's wives sighed in irritation, which for him was like being inside a very hot tornado. This was not at all a future he had ever envisioned for himself, but now that he was here, he couldn't imagine wanting any other. Chapter 48. She should have gone to Dragonvale. Cora's week in Spider's Gorge had been productive. All her preparations there were laid, and should be undetectable to any passing adventurers. Nor had she taken so much as a scratch, being more than capable of handling colossus spiders. Even better, her shadowy ally had brought back some juicy intelligence from Dragonvale, surely enough to enhance her position here. But something had happened, something beyond what it had reported. The shadow was always so irritatingly cheerful, ironically a real ray of sunshine. Whatever had transpired in Dragonvale had it tense, now, notably less upbeat, verging on annoyed. When Cora had asked, though, the mask had slammed back down, and it was all jokes and compliments as usual from then on. Jokes, compliments, and deft deflections of any inquiry about itself. Any Verity could have interpreted that, let alone one like Cora de Cron who walked in the halls of power. Whatever had happened with the dragons had rattled the creature so badly it had forgotten to even maintain its facade until she reminded it. It wasn't as if she'd ever been daft enough to trust the thing, but their mutual self-interest had made her judge it a serviceable asset for the time being. Now it was keeping things from her, and not trying hard enough to hide it. That could mean it had suffered some kind of defeat. Or that it was close to discarding or turning on her and no longer needed to care what she thought. Pondering rapidly as she stalked through the corridors of the palace, Cora concluded that she was going to have to be more careful with regard to the shadow, and begin looking into replacement allies, or at least a means of ridding herself of it. She wasn't certain it was a rogue god, but that remained her leading hypothesis, and given the news that had brought her from Dragonvale, well, there might be options. She arrived at the door and knocked, marshalling her expression and posture. Time to perform. Enter. Cora slipped inside, closed the door behind herself, and bowed. Your Majesty. Your Highness. M. Clarent. It is a relief to have you back safe and hail, Cora, said Queen Henrietta. As I promised your Majesty, I operated with an abundance of caution. In this case that meant only gathering information by remote methods, both magical and mundane, which I regret means I have only gleaned a few broad facts. Obtaining nuance would have risked drawing the attention of the dragons, particularly Mer Alafine. Good, Princess Consort Etienne stated emphatically. Vague intelligence is far preferable to no intelligence, at Deadmage, and provoked dragons. Cora nodded. I will start with the most important facts and then provide what detail I am able. To begin with, Princess Perseverance is alive. Henrietta, normally composed though she was, emitted a sharp sigh, slumping momentarily in her seat before recovering her poise and posture. Etienne gripped her hand, which the Queen uncharacteristically reciprocated. Atraximos the Dread, Cora continued quietly before they could interject, is not. At this, both royals went as still as gargoyles. Clarent leaned slowly forward in his own chair, his always intent stare sharpening to the point she could very nearly feel its pressure physically. Do forgive the banality of it, Cora, but I simply must ask, he said softly. You are certain of these facts and regrettably few others? Yes. This explains, at least, why the dragons have been acting out of character. I still don't understand what they want with the princess, but at least I grasp now why this sudden change in their habits. We have not been liberated, Your Majesty. Atraximos didn't just perish, he was replaced. They are under new management. Of course, Etienne murmured. That's how their families work. I didn't believe there were any dragons currently alive who were a match for that old monster. The closest to it were undoubtedly his own consorts. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Your Highness, Cora said, not having to feign her grimace. This is... Well, let me start here. Are you aware of the process, the mechanics by which gods and magic are formed? Clarent straightened up further, permitting dismay to show on his face. The Queen and her wife exchanged a blank look. I learned the broad strokes of cosmology as a girl, Henrietta answered. I rather doubt my understanding is as detailed as yours, Cora. It's still greater than mine, Etienne admitted. I'll have to ask you for the beginner's explanation. Of course, Cora said, nodding. I'll make it as succinct as I can, but before getting into it. The upshot for us at the moment is that we have one window of indeterminate length in which it may be possible to rescue the princess and liberate the Evervals entire from the tyranny of dragons. Once that window closes, we may find ourselves wishing to have Atraximos back. Hamed Malk-Isaac was middle-aged, more than merely portly, and highly prized his beauty sleep. On a purely physical level, scurrying through the deep corridors of the Royal Archives' restricted sections after being roused in the middle of the night did not at all agree with him. But it was none other than the Lord Regent himself who had roused him, and remained grimly tight-lipped as they journeyed deeper into the vaults. Not that this wasn't ominous, but fear and discomfort both receded into the background of Hamed's awareness even as he puffed for breath to keep up with his liege's pace. More than those, he felt excitement. He had always loved intrigue. These days, that love was tarnished. Some of his recent entanglements had left a very bad taste in his mouth. But that was that, and this was this, and Hamed had not risen to become the Lord Scribe of the world's greatest empire by shying away from a spot of clandestine excitement. The Lord Regent led him to a particular door Hamed recognized. He recognized every door, of course. He knew his archives as well as his own bedroom. This one contained documents and records pertaining to high-ranking government officials, and should have been guarded. What struck him was not the lack of the normal guards, but that they had been replaced by Commander Saphira Mafnit, leader of the Imperial Dragon Lancers. She greeted him with only a grave stare to match the Lord Regent's, and unlocked the door. This could only mean. Hamid could scarcely credit the idea, but what else could it mean? Commander Mafnit held the door for them, then followed the two men inside, finally locking it behind them. And there, up ahead, through an open archway past the short entrance corridor. The room was brilliantly lit by some sort of floating ball of magic, rather than the usual oil lamps. And there, sitting at a desk piled with papers in the center of the chamber with her back to the door. She was. He had never seen her in person, of course. Never imagined that he one day might. He had certainly never hoped to, as her absence signified that all was well. She returned to guide her empire in times of trouble, and otherwise deemed it important that mortals attend to mortal affairs and not become too dependent upon their nigh omnipotent sovereign. But there could be no mistake. Her horns arched backward over her riot of tight black curls, interlaced with threads of glistening gold. The golden edges of her bone scales glittered in the light as she slowly dragged her tail back and forth, tracing patterns in the dust. It was an odd thing upon which to fixate, but the Lord Scribe felt a pang at that dust. There was always dust in the restricted sections of the archives, despite his best efforts. As soon as cleaning staff were trained and vetted and granted security credentials to even be here. Well, having those credentials qualified them for much better paying work. The Imperial Spy Master was forever poaching his cleaners, having ample use of his own for servants with a proven skill at secrecy. It was just one of the annoyances with which Hamid had learned to live, but now the Empress was in his archives, and her tail was getting dusty. Mortifying. In silence, the Lord Regent stepped forward and knelt in the center of the floor. As protocol dictated, the Lord Scribe and Dragon Lancer Commander placed themselves to either side of him and one pace behind, also sinking to one knee. Only then did she speak. It is one thing to observe that the differences within any ethnic group far exceed those between any two, she recited, holding up the sheet of yellowing, faded paper from which she was reading aloud. Any scholar might so observe, or attempt to deny, and many have done both. It is another to have leveraged the resources of a nation to study this phenomenon, to document these findings and extrapolate useful policies for the state from them. Thus, even despite her own stated discomfort with excessive adulation, I deem it not presumptuous nor reckless as some have claimed to summarily grant Iziro a greater credibility when her arguments are challenged. It does not discredit Fatamori of Phylaxos to note that for all his insightful observation and adroit arguments, she has done the work whereas he has not. Fatamori himself has noted that no argument trumps material evidence, hence the consideration I am willing to grant him. Other critics of Iziro's writings decline to concede even that point, and thus I summarily dismiss them as irrational. Let them carry out real experiments and document the results, or still their wagging tongues in the presence of those who have. Hamid had to force himself to breathe evenly. She dug that up, somehow. Of all things, that was one of his own essays, from his university days, written when he was a teenager. Whatever her purpose, then, she was here for him, specifically. He could not decide whether to be terrified or hopeful, and so decided to be both and to keep them equally suppressed beneath his outward composure. The Dragon Empress set down the old essay and turned on her bench, not standing, but placing herself in profile, so as to look at them. No, at him. Once more, he had to remind himself to breathe evenly. The statues and carvings and portraits were one thing, but by the countless heavens she was ridiculously beautiful in person. It's rather wordy, don't you think? Iziro commented lightly. I'm afraid so, Your Excellency, Hamid replied, pleased to find his voice controlled and pleasant. I assure you, my writing style has tightened up considerably in the intervening years. Yes, I have read a number of your subsequent reports. regardless of its shortcomings. However, I think this one is my favorite, despite my general aversion to being fawned over. I know what student essays are like: padded, waffling, full of self-importance, and often more concerned with spilling enough bullshit to meet a word count than communicating effectively. This is some of those things, to be sure. But it is also, I would say, fervent, even passionate. I hope you will forgive me for saying it, Your Excellency, but I have always been a fan. I mean intellectually, all patriotism aside. I fear to say more, lest I begin to gush. I know you don't care to listen to that. One corner of her exquisitely sculpted lips quirked sideways in the faintest suggestion of a smile, and he felt hope begin to overbalance terror in that inner struggle. Then ruthlessly brought them both back into line, well aware that such a tiny sign meant nothing. "Let me pose you a hypothetical," said the Empress, once more delicately holding up his student essay in those beautiful, flesh-rending claws, her scales glittering in the magical light. "If you could stand before this young man on the day he wrote this essay, with all the wisdom of your subsequent years, what advice would you offer him?" "None, Your Excellency," Hamid answered without hesitation. She tilted her head infinitesimally to one side. "Oh. That young man went on to attain some great successes, and committed many errors in the process. The successes were nice, but it was from the errors that he learned, and I value learning above all. He figured it out. Had he been offered shortcuts, I fear it would be a much greater fool before you today." "You show wisdom," she observed, and though it was a compliment, her expression and tone were coolly neutral. "Perhaps it is merely hope," Hamid said, lowering his eyes. "I comfort myself with the idea that I will one day be wiser still, and look back on the man I am now as I currently do on the boy I was then. There have been failures in which I am struggling to find the lesson, to make it meaningful. I dearly hope everything has been toward a greater purpose." Izira nodded once. She set the paper down again, then turned fully on the seat to face them. No, again, to face him. Never in his life had Hamid seen someone rotate on a bench without getting up and manage to look graceful in the process, but seeing her now, he couldn't imagine her ever looking otherwise. "Tell me," the Empress commanded, "about Arkansas Liqueur." "Ah. Terror it was, then." In the frigid mountains in the far north of the continent, well beyond anything passing for civilization, a lone figure strode through waist-deep snow. She did not trudge, she strode, unencumbered by either the enormous weight of the snow, nor the gale-force Arctic winds which perpetually whipped back her dust-colored hair and ragged black cloak. In one hand she carried a long, gnarled staff, but simply held it horizontally at her side rather than using it as a walking aid. Abruptly she stopped, raising her head. Wind tore past her, driving the snow in gusts and sheets, but she held still as if listening. Shaking her head, the lone walker adjusted course, striding toward the nearest peak. She was as unfazed by gravity as by wind and snow, simply working up vertical surfaces when necessary rather than troubling to climb. At the top, she stopped again, raising her head as though listening, or scenting the air. This was not the highest of the nearby peaks, but it gave her a sufficient vantage. Of course, the wind here should have been enough to pick her bodily up and hurl her away. She continued to ignore it as if physics itself were a trifling suggestion. Her clothing was more bound by mortal laws, the cloak of black rags streaming away from her neck like a banner to reveal the heavily rusted chainmail beneath. After several long minutes of listening, suddenly, she smiled, and spoke to herself. Well, a new member of the family. Silly little shadow, when will you learn? It never goes your way. Ah, well. Family is family. Her voice was snatched away by the blast, would have been inaudible even to someone standing close enough to touch. No matter, she was only talking to herself anyway. With a new spring in her step, she turned and set off in an entirely new direction. South by southeast, now. Though it would be a very long walk indeed, This was a course that would take her over mountains, lakes, and everything in between, straight to Dragonvale. Toad continued.